Video games are not commonly viewed as a teaching tool. They're viewed as a diversion. They're viewed as, even a negative distraction. Jane McGonigal wrote a great book around 2011, 2012, and the book's called Reality's Broken. In this book, she posited that video games attract us for a reason. There are a number of different reasons. They create an endorphin rush. They make us feel good about ourselves. They carry us through our hero story. But she also posited in the book that we shouldn't look at that as a negative. Rather than saying that people spend too much in video games, they need to spend more time in reality, she posited that we should make reality more like video games. And we've done that really with game-based training. One of her theories is that a good video game gets your brain in the flow state within 15 minutes. And that's different from anything else you'll do that'll try to, that will get you in the flow state. You don't learn to play piano in the first 15 minutes and get in the flow state. It could take years, most likely. But a good video game will get your brain in the flow state within 15 minutes. And a video game, when it gets you into that flow state, teaches you. There are all kinds of different ways video games teach you, and anyone that's played video games or even watched someone else or your kids play video games, they can see that intuitively. When you start a video game, you're going to pick up the controls very quickly. If you're in a first-person shooter or a racing game, if you're in a strategy game or a role-playing game, you're going to learn the menu system in a good video game very, very quickly. And in some more complex games where you may have a fantasy game where you've got a potion making system that's extremely complex, you're going to be learning things in that potion making system without knowing that you're learning them, because you're in the flow of the game and you're going along. It's not just that you're playing a game, it's the way that which a good game teaches you. And some of these more complex menu systems or potion making systems, in some cases, they can be as complex as a periodic table, or certainly the kind of Linux commands you would find on a Linux box. If you're looking to learn Linux, for example, to learn how to become a cybersecurity professional, a lot of the commands you're going to learn are no more complex than they would be if you were to try to learn like a potion making system from that example in a video game. So the video games all have a way in which they teach us, and a lot of these skills stay with us for a long time. I played Dungeons & Dragons when I was a kid, the paper-based role-playing game. I can still tell you to this date some of the hit points of the monsters, the difference between a hippogriff and a manticore, things that have no reason to be staying in my brain, my long-term memory, but they're there because of the way in which the video game taught them. And so what game-based learning does is it repurposes the ways in which video games teach, to teach complex theories, complex challenges, very technical skills. And at Haiku, when we built that, we specifically used the way in which video games teach to be able to communicate those complex skills to the learners. So I don't have a formal background in video games. Somebody actually asked me that, oh, so you're a video game designer. No, I've played them though. I've played them, kind of date myself, since Pong in the 70s. And I've played as my children have gotten older and they've become adults. I've actually played video games with them all the way through. My background, first career was an officer in the SEAL teams. I got out. I worked as a consultant for a few years, and then I started my own company, Centec Global. At Centec, we had to hire hundreds of cybersecurity people, and I kept running into the issue that they did not have the hands-on skills that I needed them to have. And it really didn't matter whether they were offensive cybersecurity people, penetration testers, if they were defensive, SOC analysts, security engineers, compliance, GRC experts. A lot of them didn't have the hands-on skills regardless of their degree or their certification, and I thought, it shouldn't be this hard to give people hands-on skills. There should be a way to be able to teach them the hands-on skills, basically treating cybersecurity more as a trade than a profession. If you want to define a trade as somebody who learns the tools of a specific trade, let's say plumbing, electrician, and then learns the context in which those tools are applied, that's how we weren't treating cybersecurity. We were treating it as a profession where you need to have a degree with a lot of different contextual type of courses, but we weren't teaching people how to actually use the tools that they needed in the job, and I found that as an employer it was very difficult. And that was one of the reasons that I started. It was actually the primary reason why I started Haiku after I had sold that company off. And I looked at some of the other solutions that were out there, some of the hands-on cyber ranges, and I realized they weren't solving the problem as well as they could. And I thought about using game-based training to do that, and it kind of evolved as we went through it. We started off with sort of a gamified cyber range, and then we looked at the negatives behind a gamified cyber range and thought, how can we make that better? How can we make this more appealing for the learners, rather than just trying to take a cyber range, which is limited in its ability to teach, and trying to gamify it? We thought, why don't we actually create a game? And that was a huge step. There weren't people doing that. We had people that were creating cybersecurity hacking style games, but they weren't games that taught you real skills. And then we had people that were creating, things like cyber ranges, and they would try to gamify them, but they weren't actually games. And so what we did is we carved a new path right down the middle, and we actually created game-based training. Game-based training is actually a term that we've kind of come up with, but it's been used in different variations over the last few years. Serious games is another term that you'll hear used. We've used the term games that train as kind of our own term, but the idea there is something that is actually a game that has an educational value. It's significantly different from gamified training. I hear the terms used interchangeably all the time, and this actually came up. I was at a Black Hat Cybersecurity conference one year, and somebody said, "Oh, you do gamified training?" I said, "No, we create games that train, game-based training." And they said, "What's the difference?" And I said, "Well, gamified training is when you take some traditional method of training, and it could be a cyber range, or it could be a video, or it could be something else, a PowerPoint, for example, and you put gamification type of features on it. So maybe you give it a leaderboard so that you're competing with people, or you have badges on it that you can display on your social media, or maybe you have cutscenes that you put into there. But the training itself is still the actual training. You're still learning by watching that PowerPoint, watching that video, doing that cyber range. And so there's nothing changed about the way in which the training interacts with your mind. You're basically using the gamification features to try to get somebody to do the traditional training, but the way you learn is still exactly the same. So if that was not an effective learning method for you, for example, if you just don't do well watching videos, you fall asleep, videos have a 90% drop-off rate after 3 months online video training, then this still won't be a good way for you to learn. Game-based training, on the other hand, actually uses a video game to teach you. And so there's the interaction. It's the best practices that you build with the video game, the interaction with the game, and you use that game itself to be able to teach what it is you're trying to convey. And it's very important. There is a balance between the two, where you don't want to have a game that is too much of a game and not educational enough. Otherwise, you just have a game, and which is valuable, but it doesn't serve the purpose that you originally had, which is you're trying to convey and teach skills to people. One of the other things that good game-based learning does is it doesn't just create a game where, okay, so I am now walking around in a 3D environment and I am doing a little bit of this and I'm doing a little bit of that, and these things that I do are things that I need to do in my job. That's a start. It's getting in the right direction, but you're missing a lot of opportunity there to implement learning engineering techniques. And we actually implement learning engineering techniques in Haiku. We've worked with Carnegie Mellon University. We've done a lot of studying of learning engineering. We've sent our development team and writing team through courses in learning engineering to be able to take some of the best practices in how people learn and implement them in our products. One example of that would be spaced interval learning. That's where you take a particular bit of knowledge and you introduce it at longer and longer segments until finally it comes into your long-term memory. Another one is interleaving, where you introduce a concept once, you introduce it a second time, you give the brain a break and you let the person do something else, and then you come back in the context of a boss fight in a game perhaps, or FTX, to use a military term, a field training exercise, where you're forcing the learner to recall that bit of information, but in the context of a number of cognitive distractions. And it's one of those things that's the way our brains work. When your brain is forced to go pull that information out, and with all these other cognitive distractions, it helps put it into your long-term memory. So a good game-based training will not only be a good game so that it gets your brain into the flow state and it's interactive, it will also use these learning engineering techniques to be able to teach you without you realizing you're learning. I have a great anecdote of this. We were using Haiku as one of the simpler modules of Haiku to train the Girl Scouts of San Diego for their Cybersecurity Merit Badge. And a group of girls came up to our station. One young girl who may have been 10 years old, and the first words out of her mouth were, "I'm no good at math," which is kind of cute, something she told herself, or that she felt. 45 minutes later, she's arguing with one of the other girls about which one of the robots in the game was the cutest. What was really interesting is that at that point, she had already learned command line Linux. I could have put her on a Linux box. If I'd said list out what's in there, she would have typed ls. If I'd said change directory to the root, she would have typed cd ... And she learned this because she was in the flow state and was unaware of the things she was learning. And that really struck home for me when I was talking to a university professor, undergraduate university professor, who said he didn't teach his undergraduate students command line Linux until the end of the first semester because it was too conceptually hard for them. And I thought, we taught a 10-year-old girl in 45 minutes. Because of the game-based learning and the learning engineering that was structured in there, she never realized she was learning. In her mind, math, it was too hard for her. A great example of both learning engineering and game-based training is Duolingo. A lot of people have heard of it. Everybody has it on their phone. Talk to somebody, I'm learning Spanish on Duolingo. They don't realize how big Duolingo is. It seems like an app on my phone I can learn, languages for free. Duolingo has over 500 million people using it around the world. In the United States alone, more people use Duolingo to learn foreign languages than the entire public school system combined. It's huge. There was a great article on the founder of Duolingo, the creator of Duolingo, a gentleman named Professor Louis von Ahn. He came from a very poor village in Guatemala. And interestingly, he's the inventor of CAPTCHA, that thing that annoys us all as we're trying to, log into a website and we have to put in the letters that show up there. He developed Duolingo after CAPTCHA, and his idea with Duolingo is he wanted to get a quality education to the far reaches of the world. And he thought, I can't do that by trying to have instructors go to the far reaches of the world or by using traditional training methods. Some people just don't learn well, as we mentioned, from reading a book or watching a video, or in many cases, using a cyber range for cybersecurity. And so he created the game because games cross every single demographic in terms of being able to appeal to people. Everybody plays games of some type or another. So he created Duolingo as a game for people to be able to learn languages better, and he's extremely effective. He actually is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, where they have the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, which is one of the pioneers in doing learning engineering. So Duolingo actually embeds learning engineering into its actual application to its program. And you can see that when you're using Duolingo or playing Duolingo, when you get introduced to a word and then you get it right after, and then you get it longer intervals. That's the spaced interval learning. Or you're introduced to a word and you're introduced to it again, and then you don't see it for a while, and then all of a sudden you have a very long sentence that maybe has a number of other words, and it has that word that you originally learned, and that's the interleaving. They did a study with Duolingo and showed that one course in Duolingo French or Spanish is the equivalent of 2 years, 4 semesters of undergraduate level foreign language training in Spanish or French, which is amazing. You now have a more effective training system that's far less expensive and can be extended out to the far reaches of the world. One more example of game-based learning is a product called Healing Blade. And one of our early game designers, Dr. Francis Kong, he's actually a medical doctor, and he invented a trading card game called the Healing Blade. And his idea there was that he wanted to make it easier for medical students to be able to memorize the correct antibiotics that match up and are effective against certain bacteria. So he created a trading card game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic, The Gathering, or one of these other trading card games, Pokemon that people play. But he created one specifically for antibiotics and for bacteria, and it was extremely effective. He had great anecdotes of people who had used his trading card game, and one of them was a young doctor who had just started their residency, I believe, and they came across a pretty rare bacteria, and they immediately knew the antibiotic to use against that bacteria. And somebody asked him, how in the world did you know that was the correct antibiotic? He goes, I played Healing Blade when I was going through medical school. It's another great example of how the games give us information that stays internal to our heads for years and years after we play it. Far more so than if you just try to memorize a book for a test and then you regurgitate the information back out on the test. You don't remember it. It doesn't stay in your long-term memory, but playing games does take that information and put it into your long-term memory. Traditional training has another issue, is that it's designed for a certain way of learning, for a certain type of learner who learns very well. If you happen to be somebody who learns very well from a lecture and a book, you likely do very, very well at college, right? But there are a lot of people who are extremely intelligent who just don't learn well from a lecture or a book. In cybersecurity, we have cyber ranges. Try Hack Me, Hack the Box are good examples of those. There are dozens and dozens of cyber ranges out there. What's interesting about a cyber range, which is actually typically a cloud-based example of a computer that you would go and you would practice hacking into, typically, is that the range itself doesn't teach you the skill that you're trying to learn, right? It doesn't teach you SQL injection if you're trying to learn how to do a SQL injection attack. The range doesn't teach you the attack, how to do the attack. It tests whether you know it. And so you have to go and you have to do SQL injection, for example, and get to the root account and then find the flag and cut and paste the flag. But you didn't learn how to do SQL injection from doing that. You had to already know how to do SQL injection. So how did you learn SQL injection? You learned it by watching a video or by reading a PDF file or some other, or a lecture or something. But you didn't change the way in which you learned. You just have a way of testing it hands-on. And that's the difference between game-based training, is because game-based training, you're actually interacting with the game. You're interacting back and forth with non-player characters. You're moving through the hero story so that you feel that you are doing things that move you along and give you feedback and get the endorphin rush, in addition to doing actually the hands-on training that you would get from a cyber range, except you're actually practicing it right there. And so it's different. The one issue with traditional training is that it leads to a lack of diversity in STEM curricula. In cybersecurity in particular, there's only 24% of the cybersecurity workforce is female, for example. We actually built Haiku as a role-playing game because 60% of role-playing gamers are female. And we've had great results. We found with Haiku being used across a huge variety of demographics. Because video games do cross every demographic, every gender, race, economic, age, for the most part. Everybody plays games of some type or another. A septuagenarian or octogenarian may play different games, but they play games. They may play Sudoku, while somebody that's young and Gen Z may play first-person shooters. But everyone plays games. And we have some great anecdotes. We had 30 community college students play Haiku, and after they played, 5 of those students, so 16% of those students, switched their majors to cybersecurity because they had never thought about cybersecurity because it was too hard. It's math, like the Girl Scout example that I gave, or it's computers and I'm no good at this. But once they saw what cybersecurity could be from playing the game and getting immersed into it, they thought, I actually would love to do this. It's a high-paying profession. I'd love to do it. What's interesting is of those 5 people, 3 of them were women. And so video games and game-based training have the ability to increase diversity in a very positive way by changing the way in which we teach so that more people who learn differently than a STEM curricula can now do cybersecurity. The kid that back in the day would take apart a transistor radio and put it back together again just to see how it worked, we don't have to really convince them to get into cybersecurity, right? It's easy for them. They go in there and they know how to use all the tools, and they can get some free course online and do that. It's the rest of them, the people that could be great in this job, but they're so intimidated the first time they see a command line. Those are the ones that we need to approach. This is how we're going to address the cybersecurity job gap, and it's also how we're going to increase the diversity of people in cybersecurity, which makes the profession itself much stronger. Some of the statistics we have on game-based learning are really fascinating. We base it on getting people into the flow state, and as I mentioned, Jane McGonigal said when a good video game gets your brain into the flow state in 15 minutes. But McKinsey & Company did a study over 10 years that shows when your brain is in the flow state, you're 500% more likely to retain information when you're in that flow state. And the combination of those two things, the ability of a video game to get you in the flow state quickly, and then the efficacy that you get from that, is what we based Haiku upon. That's the primary concept of what we're doing. Some of the statistics we have are excellent. We did a research with San Diego State University where we immersed people in the game and we tested them before and after, and we saw a 24% increase in hands-on Linux skills after only 70 minutes of game immersion. That's huge. Most people can't improve their skills that quickly. Certainly not from watching a video or even just kind of downloading a free copy of Linux and playing it yourself. There's Citadel Military University used Haiku for one of their undergraduate courses, and by the end of 8 hours, they showed up to a 70% increase in hands-on Linux skills. So the statistics from game-based learning are starting to come in as we do more and more research, but we're certainly seeing it's more effective. Part of what we do is not just creating a game and taking somebody through the hero story, but it's making sure that we actually teach people in an effective way, and that's where the learning engineering comes in. We studied learning engineering. We spent a lot of time. We had Carnegie Mellon University review an early version of our game, and they came back. It was very complimentary. They said they had seen a lot of games, but they hadn't seen any that recently that had as much learning engineering built into it as we'd built in. We also work on good video game user experience development, and so we studied a book by Celia Hoden called The Gamer's Brain, which talks about how you can interact with the gamer's brain in a way that teaches them what they need to know in the game so that they enjoy the experience of the game. She wrote the book not for the purpose of learning engineering, but for the purpose of allowing people to enjoy a game by getting beyond the things that may be complex in the game, by teaching them to the user in a way that's very easy for them to do. For example, having intuitive maps. The buttons are placed in a way that I can see, so there's not a lot of cognitive distractions as you're trying to teach other things in the game, like a potion making system, for example. You don't want to have them have to translate in their head. For example, you wouldn't want to be teaching somebody French in Spanish if they're a native English speaker, right? You'd want to give them the instructions in English to teach them French, and so that's kind of what it's important to do, is the user experience actually has to reflect that, so that you're making it easy for the user. You're giving them cognitive challenges only when you want to give them cognitive challenges. Cybersecurity is already a very difficult topic in and of itself, and this is something that came up during our development, is that let's not make it too hard. If we're, for example, teaching a brand new tool, let's not teach this new tool at the same time that we're putting it in the middle of a puzzle, because now they've got to learn the tool and they've got to learn the puzzle at the same time, and they hit cognitive overload and they start to shut down. That's not good learning engineering. You teach them the tool very simply, very easily. You teach it again, and then later on, then you come in and you do it with cognitive distractions, such as with a puzzle or with a timer or something like that. That was one of the reasons we actually built Haiku in the Unity game engine versus building it into a cloud infrastructure and then trying to layer a game interface over it. One of our first iterations, we actually did build it in a cloud infrastructure, and we layered a game interface over it, but we weren't able to put enough learning engineering and enough of the game experience into that to be able to get the effect that we wanted, which was to get somebody in the flow state. It was more gamification plus, where it was kind of a game, but they were never quite in the flow state. I had a good example. I was talking to a gentleman on a plane one time, and I told him what we did, and he said, "Oh, this reminds me of a game I played when I was a kid that was a math game, and you kind of run around and you do math problems." And I said, that's interesting. I said, "How was the game?" And he said, "It was okay." He said, "But you would be going through a 3D world, and that was kind of fun, and then all of a sudden you'd stop, and you suddenly have a math problem on your screen." And he said, and it was just like doing a math problem somewhere else. And I said, "So the game took you out of the flow state?" He said, "I never thought about it that way, but that's exactly what the game did. It took me out of the flow state, and then I was just doing a math problem." And that's one thing that I see as people try to, build game-based training, or they try to gamify their training, is you've got to, it's actually a really fine balance. You have to be able to keep somebody in the flow state while at the same time communicating real skills instead of fake skills. That balance of how much of it's a video game and how much of it is a educational tool, right? That literally is the beauty of the game-based training. And there's no black and white, right? Some of it is kind of like, well, I want to be able to teach this. Well, you're teaching it in a way that's not a game. Basically, you just have a PowerPoint that you're showing them in a game. I actually had a person I was talking to one time said, "So when you're creating a new product for Haiku, you don't think about the content that you're putting into it primarily, you think about the game that you're going to build." And I said, "Exactly." And they said, "Why?" I said, "Well, most cybersecurity content, with very few exceptions that are only applicable to a niche of people like 0 days, you're not teaching anything new. If you're teaching security awareness, for example, you're teaching people not how to click on phishing attacks or smishing attacks. or how not to respond to that, that scam email. These aren't new. There's nothing new in there. There's no new content. The question is, how do you get people to both adopt and then engage in the training and complete it and assimilate the learning better? And that's all about the type of game that you have. The type of game that you have is what gets them to do it and gets them to learn better. So in game-based training, there's a balance. You can't be too gamey. And early on in Haiku, we had a kind of saying that we would say in the dev meetings, which is, we don't have any orc swinging swords, right? We were going to create a game and get people in the flow, but I don't want to have people, the game designers having an orc swinging sword, because it has nothing to do with cybersecurity. And then when we try to switch from that to cybersecurity, we have the same problem that I talked about the math game, where you're getting them out of the flow. I said what we do in the game has to keep them in the flow in a way that's consistent with the game. And so that became kind of a saying we had, was no orc swinging swords. And there was a continual push-pull between the people who wanted to build video games, like, hey, I really want to have a superhero comic book video game over here, and in order to do that, I need to make it easier for the person, and I want to have a cool sounding command, and I want to do this, and I want to do that. And we had to keep coming back. Are these skills that somebody can use in real life? If they aren't skills that somebody can use in real life, and we can't map them to a cybersecurity learning framework, then we're not going to teach them. We're not going to be teaching somebody some made-up skills or some made-up command. And that's where you see a real difference between true video hacker games like Hacknet, 19.4, some others like that, really fun games to play. And I've had people say, oh, so how was what you do different from 19.4 or some of these other games? And I said, nobody gets a job from playing those games. My goal is that somebody plays our games to be able to get a job. And so we map all the skills on the back end to the NICE framework and some other frameworks as well. And we make it easy for people to be able to document the fact I wasn't just playing a game, but I was actually learning, and here's the proof of that learning. But that is a fine balance. If you go too much on the learning and you, for example, you say, okay, now we're just going to teach people this particular module or this particular chapter of this certification, and you just write it out so that they're just reading the text in the game itself, well, now you're not getting people in the flow. There's no game part of that. And so that fine line right in between there is something that you need to look at every single day and every single dev meeting is, are we doing this correctly? And we actually have meetings called learning engineering meetings where we'll go through and we'll look at the learning engineering that's in our games, and we'll say, do we have enough learning engineering in there? And that's where it's kind of a check on ourselves to make sure, are we actually teaching? There's also a user feedback. You have to get user feedback. We do user interviews almost every week, and the feedback we get is that people love the game. They love the game. It's like nothing they've ever seen before. It's an actual game they can play that they enjoy, and it teaches them real skills as opposed to something they're going to do as a distraction. So they get to repurpose their screen time for something that actually benefits them, and they get to look at their measurable progress as they continue to go through the game.
Hi, I'm Lisa Easterly, President and CEO of Cyber Center of Excellence, or CCOE. We are a San Diego-based nonprofit that mobilizes industry, academia, and government to grow the regional cyber economy and create a more secure digital community for all. CCOE is proud to partner with Haiku Games That Train to help seed and diversify the cybersecurity talent pipeline. The games offer students, professionals, educators, and employers accessible and fun tools, including build your own games for customizable training to meet the ever-growing demand for skilled cyber workers.
The other part of the balance in game is you actually have to be able to demonstrate, let people that are playing the game demonstrate the learning that they're doing. And so we actually created an admin portal for educators and for business executives to be able to track in real time the learning of their people. That's one of the beauties of a video game, is video games and video game engines like Unity, they're actually designed to be able to monetize when your dwarf warrior walks 5 feet and opens a treasure chest, right? You can track every single thing that's happening in there far more easily than you can in a cyber range, for example. It's one of the reasons we use the Unity game engine. So we repurposed that feature of video game engines, the ability to track everything somebody's doing. We can track how many times somebody's typed nmap. More importantly, we can track how many times somebody's done that in the context of skills that are specifically applicable to a SOC analyst. So as people continue to play the game, they continue to develop their skills and be able to document and increase their resume. We have something called the Dojos that are basically repeatable side missions, and the idea for the Dojos came up. I was playing Destiny one day, and my wife asked me, haven't you done that mission before? And I said, yes. And she said, how many times? I said, maybe 100. And she said, well, why do you do it? And I said, well, they respawn with a different set of monsters and different treasure every time, but you get really good at the map and you know how to kill the boss, so it becomes easier and it's muscle memory. And that was where I thought about it. I thought, why don't we do this for our games as well? Have repeatable side missions that somebody can spend 15 minutes in when they have time. It's one of the features of video game too, is you want to be able to get in there for a very short amount of time. And they're working on a specific skill like Nmap or Hydra or some other skill, but they can actually go and practice that skill for just 15 minutes, but they're building their skill resume as they do that. And they're also building muscle memory. We had one of our players say, I've never had muscle memory in Nmap before because I never use it often enough to be able to do that. Now I actually have muscle memory in Nmap, and it's pretty cool. It's one of the features of video games is you get muscle memory from doing something over and over and over again, from continual engagement. And the repeatable side missions do that. One thing we've also found is that you have to tailor the different games for different audiences. We have some games that are oriented at the 8 through 12 grades. We have other games that we're building that are oriented towards board members for companies because they need to understand the SEC notification rules. And so you have to have a different type of game for each person. You can have a mobile app that's not going to be the same as the role-playing game that you have on the desktop. And the characters you have, board members aren't going to engage with a game that has comic book style characters, while high schoolers would love to do that. For board members, they'll engage in the game, but they need to be engaging with people that look like they're in business attire in a contemporary type of environment. You have to have a game that appeals to the particular audience that you have in a way that lets them want to play it. Then they can engage with it and they can get into the flow state. So when we built Haiku, we went through some early editions where we were trying to, make sure that we had the right balance. There was a lot of money, a lot of time that went into creating the balanced game that we have. But what we have is success. We have over 37,000 users. We have hundreds and hundreds of anecdotes who say people have never been able to learn cybersecurity. But what we have with Haiku is we have an actual game. And this was funny. I had actually given some keys to a CISO for a Fortune 500 company, and I met with him at a conference, and I said, so what did you think? He goes, you built a video game. And I laughed, and I said, yeah, I told you I built a video game. He goes, yeah, but I wasn't expecting a video game. So what do you think? He goes, I loved it. I thought it was great. I had another CISO that talked to me, and he was probably in his mid-40s, and he said, I don't play video games. He said, but all my cybersecurity people, video games are like their golf. It's not a question, do they play video games? It's which video games do they play? And he said, I need this to be able to attract and retain the best people because this is something that they want to do and they'll be able to do on their own time. A number of CISOs and IT directors who came up to me after I gave a speaking event and said, I love what you've done for cybersecurity skill training. Can you do the same thing for cybersecurity awareness training, the type of training that every employee in a company has to take to meet some sort of compliance? Because they say, my employees hate doing the training. They refuse to do it. It's like getting them to pull teeth or to go to the dentist. They do not want to do it. And if you can create a game that they want to do, not only are they going to be more likely to do it, they're more likely to actually retain the information. And so we're creating a game for that as well. Game interface itself, we built it as a role-playing game, as I mentioned, because 60% of women are role players, and also it's a great way to be able to show continual advancement of your character in this place, where your character is actually you as a cybersecurity professional. You're showing continued advancement of your skills. We have an interface that looks like a command line terminal. We teach people at the command line because most people can kind of point and click your way through a GUI. But being able to work at a command line for any cybersecurity professional that gets any deeper than the most entry-level job, they've got to be able to understand a command line. There are tools that use command lines, actually using the command line interface for operating systems, and we teach in Linux as well because Linux still is the preferred operating system used by cybersecurity people. So we have the command line interface, we have the role-playing interface, we have non-player characters that are interacting with you. And the interaction that they do has a number of different effects. It really is the driver of the game. It moves the hero story along, because you're moving along and you've got, interactions, and I've got things happening in the world that I interact to, but it also implements the learning engineering, where you introduce the concepts and then you introduce them again, as I talked about the specific learning engineering. That all comes through this interface. Something that's really interesting is our developers built a tool called Forge, and they did it to make their job easier of creating new content in Haiku. And Forge is a drag and drop interface that actually allows anyone to go ahead and build their own game-based training in Haiku. And when the developers first built that, I looked at it and I said, can we commercialize this and actually make it, intuitive enough for individuals to use? And they said yes, and so we did. And so that's how we launched Forge. Forge is really interesting but what Forge does, it allows people to actually drag and drop and create their own game-based training through a no-code interface. And so it allows them to be able to build their own networks that can replicate their own networks. They can build it for a certification. We're actually working with one of the major certification providers, and we were able to build the first module of their certification path in less than a week. Just a ridiculously small amount of time compared to traditional training methods, particularly if you're trying to build a cyber range. We're finding that we can actually build training in Forge at 1/10 the time in some cases, and certainly 1/10 the cost, because I don't have to have cloud developers, building a cyber range in the background. And so I think Forge is actually really going to change the landscape, where people, instead of saying, well, I've got the time and expense, or I need to spend $100,000 building a cyber range, I don't actually need to do that. I can actually drag and drop and create something in real time with Forge, and if I don't like it, then I can go ahead and create something else. And so it allows you to create in very short order training modules for very specific circumstances, because the investment into that training, building the training, is much smaller. And so you can build training to onboard your new personnel, your new help desk personnel, for example. The possibilities are almost endless out there for it. Our primary users are between 18 to 38 years old. And that's interesting because we've used it for Girl Scout events. We've taken it down to middle school and high school events. And it's probably one of the only tools that teaches real cybersecurity skills at that level. You're not going to take a cyber range and drop it into a high school and teach a class on it. You're going to get a few kids in the cyber club who are going to jump into it and really do well, but you're not going to teach a high school class. We're one of the only tools, and actually the only game that I've seen, that can go down to the high school level and do that. That being said, most of our users are between 18 to 38 years old. We have people that are in their 50s who are trying to change careers and reskill. And so what I've seen is people asking me, so who is going to use Haiku? And so we actually map all the skills to different nice work roles. And so we map them to the cyber defense analyst role. We map them to the cyber operator role. And so people that are going to use Haiku are people that want to get into cybersecurity, or it could be that they're already in cybersecurity and they want to maintain their skills, or they want to switch to something else. Let's say they're a SOC analyst who's working in defensive cybersecurity, but they would really love to get into offensive cybersecurity, so they're going to work on their skills in offensive cybersecurity. We have some great anecdotes. We just did an event in Hawaii with high schoolers and college students, and the person that won the competition was a liberal arts major from a college, but she was competing against high schoolers as well as college computer science and cybersecurity majors, and she beat all of them. And it's really interesting to see that. This kind of comes back to the idea that you don't have to, not only do you don't have to have a college degree, but you certainly don't have to have a technical degree to be very good at cybersecurity. And Haiku is very much like Duolingo in that, is that we want to bring education out to the far reaches of the world. We want to be able to show people that you don't have to have a computer science degree. If you're not particularly good at college and you're just not adept at learning through traditional models, you can still get into cybersecurity. You can still develop these same skills, and you can show those skills to employers. So we're seeing Haiku being used by Fortune 500 companies. We have a number of our clients that are using that for their internal cybersecurity teams. We see it used by the US government. We see it used by educators, both higher ed and grades 8 through 12 who are using it for their students. We're seeing a lot of use there. We're seeing it for people who want to use it for competitions because they want to have a specific competition. And I hear a lot of this is, hey, we're doing a competition and we want to do a capture the flag, but we want to have something that's easier for people who aren't good at capture the flags, which is the challenge, because you're not going to go into a capture the flag competition in a cybersecurity event unless you already know what you're doing. You have to know what you're doing, and so you have to have a lot of experience. But Haiku is a way to make it more approachable for people that aren't at that level yet, but want to get to that level, and so they use Haiku for that purpose as well. So game-based training versus gamified. The summary is that game-based training is actually creating a game versus gamification, where you're taking a traditional learning method and you're putting some game features on it, but you're not actually creating the game. And it sounds simple, but that balance is the key. The balance between having a game experience that gets somebody into the flow state to enhance their learning, while still embedding learning engineering techniques and making sure everything they know is a real skill, while at the same time documenting what they're doing so that they can demonstrate to an educator or an employer exactly what it is. And that's what we've done with Haiku. We've spent years and many millions of dollars developing the technology that is right there in the sweet spot. And we're continuing to develop games. We have our Forge capability that allows anyone to be able to build their own game-based training and get all the benefits of game-based training without having to invest all the time that we did. Where do I see it going from here? I think game-based training, I think it's going from bleeding edge to cutting edge to pretty much it's going to become the standard in 2 to 3 years. I think you're going to see a lot of cyber ranges being replaced by game-based training because it's far easier and faster to create a game-based training environment that actually has greater learning efficacy than a cyber range. We're actually working with the University of California, San Diego. We're creating a course based on Haiku, being taught off of Haiku, specifically for cybersecurity. We're creating a boot camp with University of California, San Diego as well, that's doing the same thing to try to address the issue of boot camps that people pay huge amounts of money for, but don't have them graduating with real skills. Haiku, much like Professor Von On's vision, has the ability to extend cybersecurity training to people who normally wouldn't be able to find it approachable. It's because of their demographic, because of their geographic location, because of the cost of training, they weren't able to do it. Haiku is going to be able to do this, and because of this, it should help address the job gap, the 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs by 2025 that we keep hearing about, increase the diversity because video games are played by everyone. And certainly I see taking game-based training beyond just cybersecurity. You can teach a number of different skills through game-based training, and we should. Jane McGonigal was very prescient in her book, Reality is Broken, when she said reality should be more like video games to make people enjoy life more. I would add to that, to allow people to learn things they might not otherwise be able to learn. That's the future of game-based training, and that's where we're taking it with Haiku.